In the previous exercise, we saw how we could control how child flex items will grow or expand or increase in size if there's extra space inside the parent property. But what happens if you scale your browser down so that there's no longer this additional space? Well, this is what we're going to learn in this exercise. Earlier, we specified our 3 columns to use a flex basis value of 300 pixels. So that's the ideal size of our layout. If the browser is scaled down, what's going to happen is the 3 columns are going to wind up being exactly the same width, exactly the same size. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. So, of course, this is the full width browser. I'm going to start scaling things down. And once we reach that ideal size, somewhere in here, just before we start seeing the 3 columns collapsing down in width, somewhere about here, now we're sitting at this ideal size. So I have this flex basis value set to 300 pixels for each of my child items, which means that we're looking at a 900 pixel wide layout, at least in my example here. So, said another way, when there isn't additional space available inside the browser window, inside the parent container, the ideal width as set by flex basis then kicks in. What happens when the browser window is scaled even smaller than our ideal size? Well, as we know already, the 3 child items, or however many child items you have, are all going to scale proportionally. And as an aside, this is where using regular floats, a regular floating layout, this is where our float layout would break, of course. But I want to mention, though, too, and much more on point, this is where flex shrink, the third of the 3 Flexbox properties that we're taking a look at here, kicks in. If flex grow allows us to control what happens to our child elements when there's extra space available, flex shrink allows us to control what happens to our child items when there isn't enough space for our ideal layout. So I've scaled the browser down here. You can see again that all 3 columns are now equal widths. And this is happening because this is the default behavior of Flexbox. But it's also happening because the default value for flex shrink is 1, meaning that all the child elements are going to wind up being the same width. So in other words, when there isn't enough room for an ideal layout, the space is evenly divided among the 3 elements. Now I'm saying here that the default value for flex shrink is 1. We haven't even defined flex shrink yet, but it's already in play. It's already happening. And by the way, if you're fine with this sort of behavior, the layout winding up like this, the space being divided evenly among your layout columns, great. You can skip the rest of this exercise. However, what I want to show you is what happens when we don't want this result, when we don't want to have the space evenly or equally divided among our layout columns. What we can do is we can use flex shrink to control how the space is going to be divided up in a scenario where the browser window or the display is too small to accommodate our ideal layout. We use flex shrink to do this. Flex shrink says, how much should I shrink myself in relation to other child elements? Versus flex grow, which says, how much should I grow myself in relation to other child elements? So in other words, flex shrink is the exact opposite of flex grow. Let me show you this in action, and I think it'll make more sense. Back inside my code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take child 1 and child 3, and I'm going to set them both to flex-shrink, :space 1, like so. Okay, give me just a second to copy and paste this down to child number 3, just like this. Okay, so they each have flex shrink 1. For the middle guy, child number 2, I'm going to set him to flex shrink 2, just like this. And I'll go ahead and save up my code. and head back to my browser. Any guesses before we refresh here? I'm going to go ahead and refresh here. And what we wind up having is the center column got a little bit narrower than the outer columns, the left-hand and right-hand column. Again, let me give you a more dramatic example of this by cranking up child number 2's flex shrink value, maybe from 2 to 5, or maybe you could try 10 or something like this. Back to my browser and I'll refresh. We're getting this result now. So again, it's the complete opposite of flex grow. With flex grow, we were increasing the value and getting a wider column. Now in this scenario, we're increasing the flex shrink value and we're getting a narrower column. But really the same thinking, the same principles apply. All we're doing is we're deciding how we should divide up the available space in this scenario when the available space is less than our ideal size. So you're more than welcome to monkey around for a few minutes, not only with flex shrink, but also with flex grow. And before I close things out, another quick reminder while it comes to mind, negative values are not accepted. Just like with flex grow, you can only use positive values with flex shrink.